Today, we're going to dig into something really interesting happening in the crypto market. There's this feeling of uncertainty out there for a lot of people, but at the same time, some of the biggest players seem to be making moves that tell a completely different story. So we're going to break down what our source material shows the smart money is really doing behind the scenes.
And that really brings us to the big question for this whole thing. Why? Why is there this huge gap between the day-to-day price action we all see and the strategic moves these major institutions are making? What is it that they see that maybe the rest of us are missing?
So the whole idea from the source material we're looking at is pretty simple, really. It argues that while many people are fearful, the big, sophisticated investors are quietly and consistently buying things up. Okay, let's dive into the evidence for that. To really get a grip on this, we're going to start small. We're going to look at the playbook of just one company, BMNR Holdings, to see what this kind of conviction looks like in the real world.
And the numbers here are just staggering. According to our source, this one company has built up a digital asset treasury worth over $14 billion. But here's the really critical part. They've done it with zero debt. This isn't some leveraged bet. It's a calm, calculated, long-term position.
And their main holding, Ethereum. We are not talking about a small, speculative play here. They hold over 4 million ETH. That is a massive, massive bet on the future of this particular asset. And this isn't just a pile of digital coins sitting in a vault. By staking some of their Ethereum, they're pulling in an estimated $87 million a year in income. It's a productive, cash-flowing treasury. I mean, that is a multi-billion-dollar vote of confidence if I've ever seen one. Now, what's really interesting here is the consistency of it all. The source points out that despite all the weekly ups and downs in price, their buying has just been relentless. They averaged over $1 billion in purchases every single month toward the end of 2025. They're not just buying, they are aggressively accumulating. Okay, so that's one company with some serious conviction. But let's zoom out a little. What about the asset they're so obsessed with? What's going on with Ethereum itself that would justify that kind of enormous bet? And this just tells such a powerful story about long-term belief. The data from our source shows this enormous line of people waiting to get in, to stake their ETH and help secure the network. And the line to get out, it's practically empty. It shows a huge preference for holding and earning, not selling. And it's not just this one company, right? The on-chain data our source points to shows the same thing happening with the biggest wallets, the so-called whales, and with institutional ETFs. They're all doing the same thing, quietly buying more, especially when prices dip. And if you want to talk about real-world use, this comparison is just wow. The value of stablecoins moved on Ethereum in just one quarter was more than half of what a giant like Visa processed in payments for the entire year. This thing is already a settlement powerhouse. Okay, so we've gone from one company to one asset. Now let's zoom out all the way to the big picture, the macro view. Because the whole market is still heavily influenced by Bitcoin and these larger economic cycles. So our source brings up something called the ISM index. Now, stick with me here. It sounds complicated, but it's pretty simple. It's basically a health check for the economy. If it's above 50, things are growing. Below 50, things are shrinking. And the reason it matters for crypto is that historically, the big bull runs really kick into high gear when the economy is booming and there's a lot of money flowing around. So here's the kicker. According to the source's analysis, that index is kind of just sitting in neutral right now. And what that suggests is that the huge economic tailwinds that fueled past crypto explosions, well, they might not even be here yet. We could still be in the very early days of a much bigger cycle. And here's another thing that's different this time. Our source highlights that unlike in past cycles, the biggest Bitcoin holders are actually buying more, even as prices hit new highs. Normally, this is when they'd be selling to new people, but not this time. They're still accumulating. Okay, and all of this brings us to what might be the most fascinating part of this whole story. It's a timeline of events our source lays out involving the financial giant Morgan Stanley, and it perfectly captures this whole theme. So let's just walk through this. On October 10th, a part of Morgan Stanley suggests a rule change that spooks the market for crypto-related stocks. For the next 3 months, prices are kind of held down by this uncertainty. Then, on January 5th, Morgan Stanley quietly files to launch its own Bitcoin and Ethereum ETFs. And literally the very next day, once their paperwork is in, that scary proposal gets canceled. The timing, as our source points out, looks incredibly suspicious.
And this is where our source just lands the punchline. The public story was all about risk and problems, but the private actions, they were all about getting into position to enter the market in a huge way. It really boils down to this. Watch what they do, not what they say. So we've looked at the case study, the asset itself, the macro picture, and that institutional timeline. What does it all add up to? What's the final takeaway from all the evidence our source presented?
Well, when you boil it all down, the source gives us 4 key pieces of the puzzle. You've got this micro example of massive, debt-free corporate buying. You have really strong on-chain data for a key asset. You have a macro indicator suggesting we're still early. And you have this whole narrative that looks a lot like institutions making moves behind the curtain.
So all this information from the source seems to point in one direction, that institutions are getting ready for something big. And it leaves us with one last big question to think about. If this is them preparing, what exactly is the future they're preparing for?